When Clara, a deaf and homeless cleaning lady, is hired by a large company, manager Daniel Carr sees an opportunity to have fun with his situation. But what he didn't know was that Clara had a hidden power. Bright Tech's office was famous for its flawless efficiency and professional environment. However, on the top floor, where managers and executives worked, there was a small secret that no one knew. Operations manager Daniel Carr, a 39-year-old man, has always had a peculiar sense of humor, often at the expense of others. He liked to find ways to laugh at everyday situations that involved his business. One of his latest jokes involved hiring a cleaning lady for the administrative sector. Daniel thought it would be funny to hire someone who was not conventional, something that could generate some laughs between him and his colleagues. He then thought of a deaf woman, someone who faced a life full of challenges, but who was oblivious to his cruel mood. Her thought was simple: how could she interact with others if she could not hear conversations or get involved in the internal jokes? This is how he met Clara. She was 26 years old, short and messy hair, and a deep look that seemed to carry all the hardness of a difficult life. It was homeless, without a family, and lived in a shelter for homeless people. Clara didn't have much, but she had a silent force, a resilience that seemed to come from a combination of years of difficulty and a clear vision of what life should be. I couldn't hear, but I could feel what others didn't say. When Clara arrived at the office, Daniel watched the contrast between her and the immaculate and tidy atmosphere where Bright Tech executives spent their days. She looked displaced, not knowing how to act very well. But Clara was not there to mix. She was there to work. She did what she needed, with a calm and dignity that Daniel never imagined she had. And although I couldn't hear the conversations, it watched everything carefully. His eyes followed the movements of others, and Daniel noticed that despite his deafness, Clara was always aware of everything that happened around her. At first, the jokes Daniel made were funny to him and his colleagues. He had fun seeing the reaction of others to the way Clara behaved. But no one knew that Clara perceived every look and every gesture. What no one knew was that she had an extraordinary ability. Her sense of observation was almost superhuman. Although he couldn't hear, she felt the vibrations around her so that others didn't even imagine. However, what began as a simple joke of Daniel soon became a situation full of nuances and surprises. The security cameras, which were there to ensure the safety of the site, began to record something much more interesting than Daniel imagined. Something he had not anticipated: Clara's true strength. One day, as he reviewed the recordings, Daniel was confronted with an unexpected show. In one of the cameras of the cafeteria, he saw Clara cleaning the floor. But it wasn't just a cleaning lady doing her job. She was watching the other employees, analyzing each expression, each movement, and, in an almost magical way, seemed to capture everything around her with impressive clarity. There was something special about it, something that transcended the simple fact of being a deaf and homeless cleaning lady. Daniel, surprised, watched the recording more carefully. He noted that even without listening, Clara reacted almost intuitively to people's interactions. When someone approached to get a glass of coffee, she changed her posture so as not to block the way. When one of the most aggressive managers entered the environment, she moved off discreetly, but while paying attention to what he did. She seemed to be in tune with the environment in a way that no other company employee was. The following days brought more surprises. Clara began to demonstrate incredible ability to realize others' problems without anyone having to say anything. She began to approach colleagues who looked more overwhelmed, offering silent but effective help. For someone who didn't hear, she connected with people in a way that Daniel would never imagine. Without words, she became the silent foundation of the team, helping where no one else cared. But what really impressed Daniel was the way she dealt with her own suffering. Clara, with her difficult and lonely life, did not use her deafness or homeless condition as an excuse. It remained a strong, worthy, and in some way, unqualified presence. Bright Tech's office was never the same after Clara's arrival. She unintentionally had become an essential part of everyday life, but no one knew of her real impact. For executives, she was just a deaf cleaning lady, doing her work without question. However, for employees, she was almost an enigmatic figure, a discreet presence, but as observant as an eagle in a hunting field. Daniel Carr continued to make jokes about her. He had fun with the fact that no one knew his true skill, and many of his colleagues also felt comfortable making jokes about Clara's condition. They saw this as a way of feeling superior, but Clara didn't seem to care about it. She simply did her work, and over time, this began to become more remarkable for others. Clara was not just a cleaning lady. She had a sharp look at the people around her. It moved between the corridors, the rest spaces, and the offices so fluidly that it looked like a shadow, something almost supernatural. If a co-worker were having a bad day, she appeared with a bottle of water or a hot towel, without a word, but with an expression that conveyed pure empathy. However, not all employees were so receptive to her. Stephanie, the marketing manager, never stopped making sarcastic comments about Clara. "Look at Lady Cleaning doing her show," he said always I saw her. Its superiority was visible and uncomfortable. While others tried to ignore the situation, Clara was never shaken by Stephanie or any other disdain. She simply ignored and continued with her work. The dynamics between employees was one of the many things Clara observed with a deep interest. She knew that each of them carried their own fears, insecurities, and challenges. She was reflected in many of these people, especially when she watched how they hid behind their success and power masks. Despite being a homeless and deaf, Clara felt that her true wealth was in her ability to see the things that no one else saw. She felt that somehow people were desperately trying to hide who they really were. Clara also connected with the cleaning team in a very special way. They were the few who treated Clara with dignity, without judging her or making jokes. She spent her breaks with them, sharing silent stories and expressing with the gestures of her hand everything she felt. Sometimes he talked about his difficult childhood, never revealing much about his current life. She didn't want to look like a victim because she knew there was much more in her life than the difficulties she faced. She wanted to be seen as a strong someone, able to live without depending on others, despite the adversities. During the daily work, Clara developed a deep connection with a colleague named Mark, the IT assistant. He was quiet, lonely, and preferred to move away from the agitation of others. Over time, he noticed Clara's presence and began to be intrigued by her. Mark knew Clara was different, but I didn't know exactly how she could capture the subtleties of everyone around her. One afternoon, while they were in the cafeteria, Clara looked at Mark, her eyes making direct contact, and he felt unusual. She signaled with her hand, asking her to approach. At first, Mark hesitated, but then approached, curious. She said nothing, but used her fingers to write on her palm. "You see people, but don't understand them. You hide behind a computer, but don't feel what they feel. What do you think they think of you?" Mark was stunned. Clara, without ever hearing a word, knew more about him than he knew himself. He had never stopped to think about it. His disconnection with others, his departure. The silent dialogue between them marked the beginning of a deep friendship. Mark began to open to Clara, talk about his life and his fears. He trusted her more than anyone else in the company, and it was through this friendship that Clara began to understand even more about human relations. She didn't have much experience with the normal world, but Mark showed her that as much as people tried to hide their emotions, there was always something behind every smile or gesture. Over the days, Clara became a silent pillar, someone who, without saying a word, impacted everyone around her. But no one, not even Daniel Carr, knew that Clara was watching something that could change everyone's life in the office. Something that went beyond cleaning and cruel jokes. Something that sooner or later would be revealed. Over time, Clara's behavior within Bright became increasingly enigmatic for employees. Those who were closer to it, such as Mark and the cleaning team, began to realize a subtle change in their actions. She, who once looked just like a deaf and homeless cleaning lady, now showed a profound understanding of human dynamics. His previously silent and discreet observations began to gain new meaning, and the impact of their actions on the company became increasingly evident. While Clara approached Mark and some others, Daniel Carr continued to have fun with her presence. He saw Clara as part of his private joke, someone to whom he could make cruel comments without worrying. However, he did not realize that in doing so, he was just feeding a situation that could leave his control. Daniel's problem was that he believed Clara had no voice. He believed that his deafness condition and life of difficulties made her invisible. Barely he knew that by underestimating her, he was about to witness something he would never imagine. On one day, the situation intensified. Clara, who used to be a discreet figure, decided it was time to intervene in a way that no one expected. During an important meeting with the executives, where Daniel was at the center of the discussion about a new, large-scale project, he made a derogatory joke about Clara's work. The room was full of laughs and accomplices, but Clara was watching, as always. She couldn't hear the words, but she could see Daniel's smile and the smiles around. She knew that somehow the joke was directed at her. a way to exclude her, to humiliate her. Without saying a word, Clara stood up discreetly and headed to the panel of security cameras in the next room, where she had already realized that she could have access. The manager, thinking she was just doing her job, didn't realize her while she moved. Clara was not just there to clean. She was there for something much bigger. Clara had something no one knew. She had begun to record office interactions for weeks, using a small hidden camera on her uniform. It was not a simple act of revenge or retaliation, but a way to show others what was really happening. She knew that the looks, the words not said, and the cruelly disguised jokes of humor were in fact a form of veiled abuse. She had collected images that revealed not only discrimination against her, but also the failures and hypocrisy of the company's executives themselves, including Daniel Carr. When Clara returned to the office, she handed the camera's memory card to Mark, which was, as always, at her post in the IT industry. He looked at her, confused but clear, with a hand gesture, asked her to watch the content. What Mark saw in recordings was a shocking revelation. Not only the jokes and disdain directed to Clara, but also a set of private conversations among executives, revealing fallacies, manipulations, and dishonest decisions that affected the company itself. Clara, not only had you registered the humiliation of you, but also discovered a series of unethical practices that could put Bright Tech in a committed situation if you are disseminated. Mark was silent, absorbing the images before him. He knew he had something powerful in hand, something that could change everything. He wanted to tell Clara that now she had the opportunity to expose everything that happened, but didn't know how she would react. She, who seemed to be the most discreet and quiet woman in the office, was now about to become a key figure in a much larger conflict than any joke made by Daniel. That night, Clara went to Daniel Carr's office, where he was doing one more of his jokes with other managers. He did not notice her presence until she, without warning, turned on the projector's screen displaying the images she had recorded. The room was silent. Daniel, not knowing what to say, looked at the other executives, who were also in shock when they see their own exposed conversations, their revealed dishonest attitudes. Clara didn't say a word. She just looked straight at Daniel, her eyes carrying a threatening calm. It was then that she used a simple gesture, pointing to the projector and then to him. The message was clear. She knew everything, and if someone were in a position of power to change things, that person would be her. Daniel, now completely disconcerted, tried to speak, but the tension in the room was palpable. Clara had created an equality situation. She, who never had an audible voice, now had the greatest weapon of all, the truth. She was at a turning point, not only for your life, but for everyone's life at Bright Tech. The silence in Daniel Carr's office extended for minutes that looked like hours. Clara, still without saying a word, stood there, like an insurmountable presence, observing the discomfort spread through the faces of the executives. The tension in the air was palpable, but somehow clear seemed comfortable. She knew what she was doing and wasn't afraid of what was about to happen. Daniel, on the other hand, was completely disconcerted. He tried to find the right words, but nothing seemed to work. He knew the situation had come out of his control. The surrounding executives began to murmur, some uncomfortable, others trying to disguise the growing panic. The man who previously made jokes about Clara was now being confronted by the truth she had exposed. It was a brutal twist he never expected. But Clara's impact was not limited to Daniel and other executives. For Mark, the discovery had changed everything. He looked at Clara with a mix of respect and apprehension. He knew she now had the power to destroy many people's lives at Bright Tech, and in many ways he knew she was putting herself in a vulnerable position. Revealing the truth about corruption within the company would be dangerous, especially for someone like Clara, who had no allies in the high level and was seen only as an unimportant cleaning lady. He also knew that as much as she had enough evidence to knock everyone down, she would not act impulsively. Clara was not of hasty revenge. She thought strategically. Mark, unlike Clara, was in a moral dilemma. He knew that the recording showed not only Clara's humiliation, but also the rot within the company itself. He who has always been reserved has now seen himself in a position where he should choose. Joining Clara in the fight against the system he helped support or maintain his position and avoid complications in his own life. He felt a weight on his shoulders, an internal conflict that made him divided between doing the right thing or protecting his career. What worried Mark most was the fact that he had also begun to question his own loyalty to Bright Tech. He had seen the way the company treated the most vulnerable employees like Clara, and that made him uncomfortable. He was beginning to realize that the things he accepted as normal, such as the exploitation of the weak, disdain by people in less power positions, were actually the pillars that supported the company's culture. And now he was facing a choice that required courage, to be complicit or act. Meanwhile, Clara continued in her position, observing everything with unconstituted calm. She knew the next steps would be crucial. She had revealed the corruption of the company, but also knew that exposing the recordings could bring serious repercussions to her and those around her. She was not naive. His life had already been difficult enough to understand that the world was not kind to the vulnerable, but she was determined to make a difference, even if it meant a great risk. What she most wanted now was a real change, a transformation in the people around her. Daniel, realizing that Clara was not willing to retreat, was pressured. He still had considerable power within Brighttech, and he knew he needed to act quickly to protect his position. He offered a solution that sounded more like a disguised threat of negotiation. "Let's talk, Clara. We can find a middle ground. You don't want to go very far with it, right?" But Clara did not respond immediately. She knew this proposal was an attempt to buy her silence, to convince her to leave things as they were, without confronting anyone. But she was no longer willing to be silent. With a calm gesture, she removed her memory card with the recordings and handed it to Mark, which was next to her. She slowly turned to Daniel and, with a serene expression, signaled with her hands, saying in her sign language, "I have done my part. Now it's with you." For Mark, that moment was an inflection point. He looked at Clara, now with a deep admiration. She was not just fighting for justice. She was challenging an entire system, a system that had marginalized both her and other people. And somehow she was inviting Mark to take part in this challenge. The next day, the situation in the office was at a break. Clara knew things would not go back to normal. She knew it was time to prepare for the consequences. Daniel had begun to take steps to try to counteract the threat she represented, trying to find a way to get around the situation. But Clara was one step ahead. She knew that to win this battle would need more than just courage. She would need allies. And as the tension grew, what no one knew was that Clara's true power was just beginning to reveal itself. The impact of his actions was beginning to spread, and the company was beginning to ask itself, who really controls the game? The tension in Brighttech's office continued to grow. What once seemed like a simple question of a cleaning lady being the target of jokes became a much more complex scenario. Daniel Carr, accustomed to controlling everything around him with his authority, is now trapped in a situation he could no longer manipulate. Clara had thrown the most powerful cards of the game, the truth and justice. The morning after the confrontation, the office looked like a silent battlefield. Many of the employees were starting to realize that something big was happening. Security cameras had registered the events, and Clara's recordings were circulating behind the company's curtains, although no one knew for sure how or when it would happen. Daniel knew he needed to act fast. He summoned an emergency meeting with major executives and Mark, who was now responsible for monitoring security cameras. He still didn't know how Clara had gotten access to the images, but one thing was clear. She was no longer just an unimportant cleaning lady. Clara now had the power to destroy the company's reputation, and Daniel was not willing to allow it. When all major executives were gathered in their room, Daniel began the conversation with a serious tone that he rarely demonstrated. "We have a problem," he said, looking straight at Mark. "Clara has managed to access confidential information. She has recordings that can destroy everything we build here." Mark looked at Clara, who was sitting calmly in a corner of the room, her imprisonable expression. He knew he was at a point of no return. Although he had tried to maintain a neutral posture, his role in the situation was clear. He had helped Clara. He knew what she wanted: justice. But he also knew that if she were too far away, the repercussions would be deep. Daniel turned to other executives, his most threatening tone now. "If anyone knows somehow that she got these recordings, or if someone is helping her, we need to act immediately. This situation needs to be contained." At that moment, Clara finally spoke. She got up slowly, her fixed eyes on Daniel. She didn't need words to show that she was in control of the situation. Using your gestures, Clara signaled, "You want to silence my voice, but you can't do that. You can't erase the truth." The executives were silent, watching. For the first time, Clara was not just like an invisible piece in their game. She was challenging the power structure they had created, a structure that kept them safe while neglecting those most vulnerable. Daniel, now visibly annoyed, stood up. "Do you think you have power here? You can simply expose us all and go unpunished? This is a threat to our company, Clara, and I'll make sure no one else finds out your recordings." But Clara didn't go back. She knew the moment of acting was now. She made a quick gesture asking Mark to turn on the computer. As he did this, she approached Daniel, her challenging eyes. "You underestimated us all," she said, her voice finally breaking the silence that hovered over the room. "I don't need words to defeat you. The truth is enough." At the same time, Mark opened the file folder on his computer and clicked on a specific video. What appeared on the screen was something that none of the executives expected. It was not just the images of the jokes made by Daniel and the others about Clara. What was being displayed were recordings of private meetings, where Daniel and other executives were discussing unethical practices that involved bribery, fraud, and manipulation of financial reports. Clara had not only registered hostility against her, but she had unintentionally captured the corrupt plans of the entire company. Now the focus was on something much bigger. The evidence of corruption was clear. Clara had something that would not only hurt Daniel's reputation, but would also ruin Brightech. What she had done, without even realizing it, was to put all the executives in a position where their secret could no longer be maintained. The room was completely silent. Daniel, who was already starting to feel safe in his position, was now lost. He tried to formulate words, but nothing came. He knew that if this information leaked, the consequences would be catastrophic. Clara turned to executives, her calm expression, but now with silent power that no one could ignore. She was no longer just in the face of a personal decision. She was facing a moral choice that would affect everyone. But what surprised them most was their calm. Clara knew the way ahead would not be easy. She was throwing her last cards, and her destination was now in the hands of those who had the courage to do the right one. "I don't want to destroy your business," she said firmly, "but I won't allow them to destroy what is right. If you want it to end now, the only option is to change. I've done my part. Now it's with you." The room was tense. To Clara, the battle was just beginning. And for Daniel, the world was about to collapse. The impact of Clara's words echoed through the room. The silence that followed seemed even heavier, as if the weight of the truth was now about all present. Daniel Carr, who was always the man with the answers, did not know how to react. What had been a cruel joke about a deaf and homeless cleaning lady, someone he had completely underestimated, was now threatening to destroy the founding of his career and possibly the reputation of the entire company. Mark, in turn, was completely divided. On the one hand, he was relieved by Clara finally exposed the corruption he knew to exist. On the other hand, he also knew that there was no return. From that moment on, his life at Brightech would never be the same. He had taken a position, but the price of this was not yet clear. And although he knew that the truth was on Clara's side, he feared the consequences they would both face. The company, with its culture of power and control, would not simply accept being unmasked without a fight. Clara, in turn, remained serene, but inside her there was a whirlwind of emotions. She knew the truth had been thrown into the air, but what would happen next depended on others. She had already done her part, had already shown that she was not willing to be silenced. Now she hoped that those who were in power would make a decision, but she also knew that the people who were there, the same ones who had mocked her, would do anything possible to save their own skins. The first to break the silence was Roger, the financial director, a 45-year-old man, known for his rigid and cold stance. "That's absurd," he said, trying to keep calm. "You don't have the right to invade our privacy in this way. This is illegal." Clara, with the calm that seemed to dominate her entire presence, only gestured slowly, signaling, "The legality of your actions is what is in question now. I don't care about your privacy. I care about the truth." She didn't hurry. She didn't exalt herself. The serenity in his stance contrasted with the agitation he was taking over the others in the room. The other executives were beginning to realize how vulnerable they were. Stephanie, the marketing manager, who had always treated Clara with disdain, tried to recover from the situation. "Daniel, you need to do something. We can't let it destroy everything we build." Daniel, trying to recompose herself, looked at Clara. There was a mixture of anger and admiration in his eyes. "What do you want, Clara? What do you want from us?" Clara's answer was simple and direct. "Nothing. I don't need anything from you." I just want the truth to be heard. That's what you have to face now. While Daniel and the executives desperately tried to control the situation, Clara was no longer willing to negotiate. She knew the company would not change without external pressure. She also knew that the recordings would not be enough to knock the executives alone. But she had a plan in mind, something she had prepared in the previous days. That afternoon, Clara did what few could imagine. She sent an anonymous email to a series of investigative journalists, including some of the largest media vehicles in the country. The content of the email was clear, a complete exhibition of the recordings she had made, detailing not only the humiliation of her person, but also the fraudulent practices that had taken place at the private meetings of executives. The tests were now in the hands of those who could really make a difference, the public. The effect was immediate. Within hours, the press began to publicize the story. The recordings spread like fire, and soon Bright Tech was at the center of a storm of criticism. Investors, consumers, and even employees themselves began to question the company's integrity. It was no longer a matter of Clara being just a cleaning lady. Now she was seen as the heroine that exposed an internal corruption network. Daniel and the other executives tried in every way to control the damage, but it was too late. The truth could not be erased. Investigations began rapidly, and regulatory agencies began to interrogate Bright Tech's leaders of their practices. In an internal crisis meeting where Daniel tried to blame others to save his own image, he was completely isolated. The company he had helped build was crumbling before him, and there was nothing he could do to avoid collapse. Clara was not there to watch her fall. She was not there to see the company destroyed. She had already done what she needed, and now she knew that she had started an irreversible change. Mark, watching everything from afar, realized that Clara's courage was not just justice. It was about resilience and never letting oppression and abuse define your life. She didn't need permission to change the course of things. She had done it silently, but powerful. While executives faced inevitable processes and investigations, Clara disappeared from the spotlight. She has not sought recognition or boasting. She knew that in doing what she did, she not only broke free, but also gave an example that even the most vulnerable have the power to alter the fate of a large corporation. After the storm of scandals and the exposure of corruption at Bright Tech, Clara's life took an unexpected course. She, who had once been ignored and despised, was now an inspirational figure. However, for her, the real victory was not in public recognition, but in the change she had caused. The transformation was not only in the company but within it. Clara didn't look for the spotlight. What she wanted was much deeper. Freedom. Freedom to live without being stigmatized, being treated with dignity, of having a chance to choose your own way. She had not fought for fame or applause. She had fought for truth and justice. She knew that by exposing Bright Tech's flaws, she had faced a corrupt system that made those most vulnerable, like her, were seen as disposable. In the early days after public revelation, Clara returned to the shelter where she lived. She knew her life was still far from easy, but she felt something that had not felt in a long time, a sense of empowerment. What she did was not just a fight against the company. It was a fight against everything that made her feel invisible, against the system that pushed her into the background of society. Meanwhile, Daniel Carr and the other executives faced the consequences of their actions. The investigation revealed more than just financial corruption. It was found that they had manipulated data to deceive customers and investors, hiding failures on the company's products, and pressing employees to cover up errors. What Clara had exposed was not just a moral failure, but a complex scheme of manipulation and mistake. The impact of this was so great that Bright Tech suffered a massive drop in the value of its actions and eventually was forced to undergo a complete restructuring. Several executives were fired, including Daniel, who now faced charges of fraud and corruption. While the culprits faced justice, Clara sought her own path of healing and growth. She knew she needed to start over, but this time in her own terms. That's when she began to explore opportunities outside the shelter and began to rebuild her life. Mark's support was crucial in this process. He became a kind of mentor for her, not only helping with practical issues but also offering emotional support while Clara was beginning to take her first steps in a new world. Clara started taking online courses, something that once seemed impossible to her, has learned the sign language to better communicate and to develop new skills. She also got involved in group support groups in street situations, sharing her story and helping to make the difficulties that those who lived on the sidelines face. What she wanted most was for people to understand that being homeless did not mean being invisible, that being deaf did not mean being unable to understand the world around her. Over time, Clara found work in a non-profit organization that helped reintegrate people in street situations to the job market. His role was not that of a cleaning lady or someone who only performed operational tasks, but a counselor who helped others find his own way. Clara knew she had a lot to offer, not in terms of positions or wealth, but in wisdom, life experience, and empathy. Mark, on the other hand, also underwent a transformation. The man who once felt stuck to a job that moved him away from his true essence now was inspired to do more than simply surviving in the system. He began to engage with social justice organizations, helping to promote a more inclusive and transparent work environment. He knew that alongside Clara, he had discovered something fundamental. It was not necessary to be powerful to make a difference. Sometimes the greatest heroes were those who rose when no one else expected. While Clara continued to grow and reinvent herself, she was also recognized for her role in BrightTech's exhibition. But unlike many heroes' stories, she did not want to be seen as someone superior, but as a woman who had made an important decision, and in doing so, had shown that the world did not need to be so unfair. What Clara wanted most now was to be able to look back and see that her journey of overcoming had a deep meaning. She was no longer being defined by the circumstances in which she was born or the difficulties she faced. She was Clara, a woman who raised herself, who used the truth as her weapon, and who found in herself a strength she had never knew that existed. The last time Clara saw Daniel Carr was in a court where he faced the charges of fraud. He looked at her with an expression of defeat, as if he finally understood the impact of his actions. Clara, in turn, felt no anger, no revenge. She just felt relief. Relief knowing that she was finally free, that the weight of her previous life would no longer define her. She had surpassed. And so Clara not only turned her life, she had become a symbol of resilience and courage, showing the world that even the most marginalized, most silent people have the power to change the game. What seemed to be a simple moment of justice now became a larger movement than Clear ever imagined. As time passed, his story of courage spread, not only throughout the city but throughout the country. It became a symbol of resistance to those who, like her, were invisible to society, homeless people, deaf, or anyone else marginalized by power structures. Meanwhile, the repercussions for BrightTech were immeasurable. The company, which was previously seen as a pillar of innovation and growth, was now at the center of a scandal that reverberated by all sectors. The government had begun to investigate corruption practices within the company, and Daniel Carr, the man who, years earlier, controlled everything with his cruel jokes, was now facing serious accusations of fraud, abuse of power, and manipulation of financial data. He had become a fallen figure, the embodiment of all that Clara had exposed. However, contrary to what many imagined, Clara was not there to see the company collapse. She had done what she needed to do. His mission was not to destroy BrightTech, but to expose the truth, force change, and open people's eyes to what was happening behind the curtains. She knew her journey was not over yet, but the way ahead would be crucial to defining the legacy of her fight. Clara was preparing for the next step. Now, with the attention of the public focused on the truth she had revealed, she knew that the most important thing would be to ensure that the necessary changes were made. She didn't just want BrightTech to be held responsible. She wanted her work to open doors to a real transformation in companies and institutions across the country. She wanted to make sure other people didn't have to go through what she went through to have a fair chance in life. It was at this moment that Clara had an idea. She knew that the impact she had had on the company was in her final phase. BrightTech was starting to undergo a restructuring, and Daniel Carr was losing control with each passing day. But she wanted to go beyond that. She wanted her action to turn into something lasting, something that really caused a significant change in society. Clara, with the help of Mark, who had become her greatest ally throughout this journey, planned a public event that would gather activists, journalists, and other social influencers to discuss how large corporations should be held responsible for their actions, and how society could help people like Clara were never treated with disdain. The event would be a turning point, the moment when society would finally begin to question the standards of power and the true nature of large companies. Mark was reluctant at first. He knew that Clara's public exposure could mean more pressure, more negative attention, and that she was still vulnerable. But he also knew this was the chance of Clara to do something even more significant. They couldn't stop there. What Clara had done was great, but the real change would only come if they took one step further. It was time to create a movement that was even stronger than the scandal. As the date of the event was approaching, Clara began to feel the pressure. She knew that many saw her like a heroine, but for her, the challenge was how to ensure that her struggle had long-term consequences. She wanted to leave a legacy of justice, not only for her but for all those that society ignored. But she also knew that the public exposure of this magnitude had its price. There were those who wanted to see the failure of their struggle, those who were ready to attack their image. When the day of the event arrived, Clara was nervous but determined. She knew the stage was ready for her. The event would be broadcast live and reach millions of people. It was not only an opportunity to make a difference, but also to inspire those who were in situations similar to hers. She took the stage in front of a large audience, and the silence in the room was almost palpable. Clara looked at everyone who was there, some with skeptical looks, some with expressions of admiration. She had come from a place of pain and difficulty, but now she was about to be the voice of something much bigger. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm, but full of emotion. "I'm clear," she started, "and I'm proof that no one is invisible, even when society tries to make you." Your message echoed through the room. It was the message of resilience, courage, transformation. Clara was there not only to tell her story, but to invite everyone to join her, to fight against the injustices that permeated society. She didn't want to be just the woman who destroyed a corporation, but the woman who helped rebuild a fairer society. And while the audience applauded, Clara knew that she was finally ready to face the climax of her journey. Clara's event, broadcast live to a global audience, had become more than a simple opportunity to expose injustice. It was now a platform for something much bigger, a silent revolution that began to gain strength on the streets, in the hearts of the people who saw a clear inspiration. She was no longer just a woman who had unmasked a corrupt company. It had become a symbol of change, resistance, power for those who were often seen as powerless. As she spoke on stage, her voice echoed with the confidence that only someone who has already faced the deepest adversities could have. She was not just exposing Bright-Tech's corruption, she was exposing the bankruptcy of a system that always favored the powerful, leaving the most vulnerable on the sidelines. The impact of the event was instantaneous. Not only those who were present, but millions around the world began to see Clara as the catalyst of a new era of transparency and responsibility. As she spoke, the camera focused on her eyes, which conveyed a mixture of emotion and determination. She knew that this moment would not only be remembered as a speech, but as a milestone in history. It was the culmination of her struggle, a struggle she had fought alone, without support, without resources, only with her will for justice and her indomitable courage. But Clara knew she was no longer alone. She now had the support of all who had somehow felt touched by her journey. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the world was watching. The media was shocked by Clara's story, and the reactions on social networks were intense. Justice para Clara began to spread like fire, with people sharing their own experiences of fighting against oppressive systems. The hashtag became a wave of solidarity that involved not only those who had a direct connection with Clara's story, but also those who saw an expression of all social injustices that needed to be confronted. But the real impact came when large organizations began to react. The day after the event, the government announced a national investigation into the practices of large corporations and the power they had on people's lives. Bright-Tech's situation, which seemed an isolated case, expanded to a global issue: how the corporate system was bankrupt in terms of ethics and social responsibility. Within Bright-Tech itself, the pressure increased. Daniel Carr, who had been in the eye of the hurricane since the beginning of the investigation, was now facing a total collapse. He was finally arrested, and the charges of fraud, corruption, and abuse of power accumulated against him. The company was forced to pay billions in fines, and many of the executives who had been accomplices in the manipulation of business practices were being fired or facing lawsuits. What seemed like a battle wins by Clara was now reflected in a larger movement, in which many companies were being forced to reevaluate their practices and submit to a new pattern of transparency. The impact on Clara, however, was not instantly a personal victory. She had already been responsible for dismantling the corruption network inside Brighttech, but now the pressure on her was at a level she had never experienced before. Interviews, partnership requests, and book offerings began to arrive, but Clara knew her fight was far from over. She didn't want to be a public figure, a celebrity. She wanted more than anything to ensure that the change was real and lasting. However, Clara began to realize something fundamental during this turbulent period. She had the power to create change, but this power was not her fame or personal history. What really mattered was how she could inspire others to get up. She had created a wave of empathy, a justice movement that spread beyond companies and even affected the small communities, where those who were marginalized now felt that they had a voice. While Clara and Mark argued what would come next, she realized that her personal journey had become something much larger than she imagined. The work she had begun with a simple desire for personal justice was now shaping the future of a fairer and more equitable society. What she did was not just an isolated action against a corporation, but a change of mindset to all. Mark, who had always been skeptical and somewhat distant, was now convinced that Clara was more than just a survivor. She was a leader, a transformation force that had aroused a worldwide movement. He, who was initially involved with Clara's cause for empathy, was now deeply committed to the cause, helping Clara to build platforms to ensure that her fight was not just remembered, but taken later. While the world watched this impressive outcome, Clara knew that the true climax of her journey was not Daniel's arrest or the end of Brighttech. It was the change in people's hearts. She had challenged an unfair, but more importantly, she had shown to the world that everyone, regardless of her origin or circumstances, have the power to transform her reality and to create a fairer society. Clara's impact on the world was not a matter of fame or recognition. His journey was not a personal revenge, but a struggle for truth, dignity, and justice. When she had exposed Brighttech's flaws, she did not imagine that her action would trigger a social revolution. It was not just the fall of a corporate giant she wanted to provoke, but the change in the way society saw those who, like her, were on the sidelines. Clara knew that the path to true change would be long. She had taken the first step, but the world needed more. What Clara really wanted was that her story wasn't an exception, but a rule. She wanted the power of each individual to be recognized, that people no longer needed to fight alone in a system that overwhelmed them. The truth she had unveiled about Brighttech and about the hypocrisy of large corporations was now at the center of political and social discussions. But Clara didn't need applause. When the scandal finally began to dissipate and the name of Daniel Carr was no longer discussed in the headlines, she withdrew to what had become her new life. The woman who once lived in a shelter, which had been seen as invisible, was now at the front line of a much larger battle. She was dedicated to working with homeless people support organizations, with groups fighting corruption and social exploitation. However, Clara kept her personal life away from the spotlight. She no longer tried to be the heroine in her own story, because she knew that real work was in rebuilding communities, creating a future where people had the opportunity to start over, just as she had done. His greatest pride was not in the destruction of Daniel Carr or Brighttech, but in seeing the lives of thousands of people feeling that his struggle had inspired others to raise his voice. Mark also went on with his life, but his partnership with Clara was never forgotten. He dedicated his work to what he now called active social justice, using his position in the corporate world to change internal structures and policies in companies, ensuring that Brighttech's mistakes were not repeated. Together they formed a support network that grew every day. Clara, with her silent strength and determination, was no longer the woman who hid in the shadows of an office. She had become the light for those who followed her. For many, Clara was a symbol of what everyone could be, agents of change, people who, with a little courage and truth, could turn the game. Her story, though completed, left a deep lesson. No one, not even the weakest, is really powerless. Power is in the voice of truth, and no one can silence it. Clara shows us that everyone, regardless of the adversities they face, have the power to transform their realities and fight for justice. Do not allow fear or invisibility to define your future. Get up, share your truth, and inspire others to do the same. The change begins with each of us. If Clara's story has touched your heart, share it, and be part of the movement for a fairer and more transparent world. Your voice can also be the flame that lights the transformation. Join us. The power of change is in your hands.